was inspired this week, as I am every week, by Lillian. So last week she was talking about conversations with God, and as part of that she talked about Abraham's conversation with the angels prior to the destruction of Sodom as an example of a conversation with God. And that really that really made me think. And I was like, not that conversation, but then what followed on about Lot's wife and the destruction of the city, and how does that fit in with the picture of God that we now understand? And then I also came across Hebrews 12 this week, so I'm going to try and combine a New Testament scripture and an Old Testament scripture to help us get a balanced view of God's discipline and what God's discipline looks like. Okay, so it's on the screen, but if you want to look it up as well, you can do. This is Hebrews 12. I'm going to start at verse 4. So, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood, and you have completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son. It says, and this is a quote from Proverbs here, it says, "My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as a son." Ensure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate. You are not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined for us a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So, this passage has been used to put loads of things forward. I've seen people using this passage to promote the idea that God punishes us, that when bad things happen, that is a way of being God punishing us, and using this using this scripture to back it up, which I can see how you could read it that way. So we're agreed we're God's children, I hope. Yeah, and part of being a child is to be being disciplined. Right, we'll come on to defining discipline in a minute. But to most people, discipline has to involve punishment. Right, it certainly does in school environments and most work environments as well, doesn't it? So when bad things happen to us, you can imply from this that God's punishing us, but it's okay because he loves us and he wants the best for us. We're better off being punished because the pain is worth it. That would be the traditional interpretation. When I chopped my fingers off, that was God punishing me, as any loving father would. I'm not sure what I was being punished for, but I'm sure I learned from it anyway. God knows what's best. It's just all part of his discipline. Thankfully, I'm not getting many amens here. Right? Obviously, I don't think that. But that's where some people go with verses like this. Particularly if you read the King James and the Authorized Version, instead of they use the word, it's only in this one once, but they use the word chastening instead of discipline most times there. But as I've said before, we need to read everything through the lens of Jesus. So does what I'm reading correspond to the words and actions of Christ? Or maybe should I say, does what I think I'm reading correspond to the words and actions of Christ? So let's look at that. Did Jesus punish the woman at the well for adultery? Did he get Zacchaeus down from his tree to give him a beating? Was Peter given extra chores to do for denying Christ? No. Jesus wasn't into punishment. There's nowhere that Jesus punishes people. Let's look at how Jesus dealt with disciples when they made mistakes. And the disciples were always getting it wrong. Despite spending so much time around Jesus, they always got things wrong and made mistakes. But what did he do with them? Well, he didn't exclude them. He didn't say 10-day suspension from discipleship. You can go out into the wilderness for 10 days. He didn't find them. He didn't even shout at them, as far as we're told. What he did is he taught them and he explained patiently the truth. He forgave them and encouraged them to get it right the next time. He built them up. And it worked. Because that team of disciples, they literally went on to change the world. Right? But as a team building strategy, it clearly worked. You can't say, oh, Jesus would have got better results if only he'd treated those disciples a bit more harshly. If only he'd punished them a bit more, then think we're Christianity. No. That was a team that changed the world. So, let's try and understand this a bit better. So, the Greek word that is translated both as discipline and rebuke here in Hebrews is this one, right? Paidein. And paidein comes from paideia. And paideia was actually a Greek methodology used to train the young Greek citizens. But a child who had been through the system of paideia would be a well-rounded intellectual. They would have good morals as well as being physically fit and able. So it was a whole system of educating the young citizens of Greece at the time. And I did a bit of research. I could find no evidence of physical punishment being a part of that system. It might have been, but I couldn't see any evidence of that. There's loads of words we get from this. Pedagogy, so the science of teaching, comes from here. So paideia, which is translated as discipline, is more teaching. It's more education than discipline. My understanding, anyway. So let's go to a good old King James. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and he scourges every son whom he receives. Well, can you imagine why people reading this a long time ago would have got a picture of an angry God from here, can't we? The word chastening there, the word in that King James is that paidu, which I've just discussed, which is better translated as teaching. Rebuke is also that paideia, so teaching. Yeah. So my son, do not despise the teaching of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are taught by him. Sounds a lot less harsh, doesn't it? For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. Chastens, again, right, is education. Right, scourges is interesting, right? Scourges is this Greek word mastigoi. Mastigoi. And that does actually mean physical punishment. Right? It's used to describe whipping people in other places. Okay? So, are we saying that Lord physically punishes every son whom he receives? Because that is kind of what the Greek's saying there. Well, that doesn't match up with Jesus to me. If I go back to the original here, this bit here, this verse 6 and 7, this is where he's quoting Proverbs. Right? So this isn't the Hebrew writer speaking, he is quoting Proverbs at this point. Proverbs being written 500 years or so ago, before all this happened. I suspect that the Hebrew writer is using those two verses from Proverbs there because the Hebrews who he's writing to would be familiar with the Jewish scripture and it would help make his point later on. But I don't want to read that one line there about scourges every son over because the Hebrew writer has chosen to use it. It doesn't overwrite everything else that's been written about that we know about the character of Jesus. I don't believe we can use that verse to say that God physically punishes every son he receives.
I'm just having a look at the mirror. It doesn't mention.
No.
It translate. There's no scourging in it.
No, I looked that up in the mirror. Yeah. No.
Do not undervalue the loving instruction of the Lord, neither become despondent when you are corrected. Loving instruction, and it actually uses parakletos as well.
I'm going to come to that in a minute, so hold that thought for me.
Right, okay.
But that's good. No. But this mastogai, which is scourges, it is in the original Greek, and it does, as far as I can see, mean physically punish. Right, but I think that is quoting something from Proverbs, and we'll come to looking at the Old Testament way of thinking about this in a minute, rather than rather than the Hebrew writer saying this is where I am with my thinking, if that makes sense. Don't forget also the word like discipline, or disciple comes from discipline, Both disciple and discipline mean to teach. But I think because as humans we like violence and we like teaching people a lesson and punishing them when they upset us. If someone wrongs us, we naturally want to see something bad happen to them too and make us feel better. I think we automatically then jump to this passage about God punishing us jump to this passage should be about God punishing us. Well, can I put it to you that we can correct and teach people without punishing them? There's lots of teachers in the room, and hopefully we know that's true from there.
I would say that it would limit that the child couldn't be taught in that way, in a good way.
Yeah, definitely. When the Hebrew writer here is talking about paideia, I believe he's saying that God wants to train us in his ways. In ancient Greece, education was often found in the form of educating men passing on that knowledge in a way very similar to an apprenticeship. Every father wants to train their children with the knowledge that they have and teach them not to make their mistakes. Now that's probably easier for God because he doesn't make mistakes. But we want to make our children to be like us. Right? And I think that our Father God wants the same for us, to train us up to uncover who he made us to be. Because the more we are like him, the more we are like our original creation. And the more Christ-like, and then the more Christian that we are. I can't believe that means he wants to punish us. Right, I love this phrase by Brad Jerzak, who I was talking about earlier. He says that God's discipline is restorative, not retributive. The purpose and the methods of God's discipline, of God's training, isn't to break us down, it's to encourage. It's not to retributively punish, but to lovingly restore us. God's aim in his discipline and correction is, like in everything he does, to restore us to how he made us to be. God's discipline is restorative and not retributive. Eileen was talking about the Mirror translation a moment ago. So Francois de Troyes, who wrote that in the translation notes for these verses, he says, God's discipline is meant to teach, not to punish. Well, here comes the cynics. But let's look at verse 7 in the NIV. Okay, let's do that. I've highlighted it there. In the NIV it says, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. Endure hardship as discipline. So is that not then saying that we should think of bad things as being God's discipline? When something bad happens, it's a punishment from God, and we should endure that hardship and be thankful for it. Well, it's God's discipline and you'll be stronger because of it. I looked at this in other translations, they get even worse. That's the NIV. New Century Version puts it like this. So hold on through your sufferings, because they are like a father's discipline. The Mirror obviously gets it right. Embrace correction. His instruction confirms your true sonship. But I don't like just to take, because the Mirror is a translation I like there, I don't just want to go, that must be right, and I'm going to ignore the other two. Right, so I really went into quite a bit of depth here, sort of looking at the translation of this. Okay, so this is the original Greek. Now, Hebrews, even though it was written for the Hebrews, who would have spoken Hebrew, it's actually been recorded in Greek, bizarrely. We're not quite sure who wrote Hebrews. There's the version we have might have been translated into Greek by Luke at some point, but anyway. So this is a translation, right? Aispedion hypomente hos hoios hymen prosperate ho theos tis. That's my Greek. I've got no Greek blood whatsoever. Right, but let's go for that in order. Right, so the first word, ais, is just as, to, into. It's often used like when they went into a town, they went into a city, etc. Paideon, we talked about discipline, training, teaching. Okay, this hypomenete is to remain under, to remain behind, to endure. Right, endure is a bit of but it's used when there were 2 disciples who were left behind and the others went on, and they said hypermentate was the word used, they remained behind in this town. Okay? Hos is just as, again. This hoios is sons. Imen is to you. This prosperity is then to deal with, ho is which, and theos is God. Okay? I can't see anything in there that translates that as to hold on through your sufferings because they are Father's discipline. But to me it says it just says remain under God's correction. Remain under God's correction. His discipline shows that he's treating you as his child. Right? Remain under God's correction, remain under God's teaching, and that shows you that he's teaching, that shows us that he's teaching us as his children. Right? I cannot understand, and I put the King James up on there just for fun, but I cannot understand where these translations get this idea of hold on through your sufferings or endure hardship as discipline to suggest that when bad things happen, that's God teaching us. I just can't see where that's come from the original text. Now, remaining in God's discipline. Well, that still might sound a bit scary if you don't really think about it, isn't it? Remaining in God's discipline. But when we know that God's discipline is restorative and not retributive, when to remain in God's discipline is to let him restore you, to let him work with you to restore you, then bring on the discipline. That's what I'm after. But then, if it's not punishment, what does that discipline, what does that look like in a practical way? Well, I thought about that, but I thought actually I'm asking the wrong question here. I want to change a few things. So let's stop using this word discipline because we all interpret it wrongly. We all jump to punishment when we hear that word. And I also want to ask another question. In what circumstances would require God's teaching? What circumstances require God's intervention? Well, let's go back to looking at our definition of sin that we looked at the other minute. What do we define sin as the other week? Things that... Well, this was your definition. What were we really saying sin was defined as? So things that separate us from God. Yeah? Sin are things that get in the way of us being with God. Yeah? Things that separate us from him. So... does sin require correction? Well, yeah. If there are things that are separating us from God, then that requires correction. So when we are involved in something that is taking us in the wrong direction on our journey of restoration, when there's something preventing us from living our identities as his children, then that needs correction. But what does that correction look like? Well, it looks like the same as it does with Jesus and his disciples, with him sitting down with us, calmly pointing out what's separating us and giving us options we can choose to take to get back on the right path. What if we don't listen? What if God tells us that and we're not listening? Well, he'll just keep on trying to tell us. As he did with the disciples, he'll let us make mistakes and let us deal with them. And I believe that the journey of deconstruction of our ideas that many of us have been on recently has been a really good example of that. There were some beliefs that we had individually and as a church that were getting in the way of our relationship with him. And he has corrected us on that through, and he did that through words from Jeff primarily and other people, for pointing us in the direction of reading, by putting the right people in the right places, but most importantly by speaking directly to us as a spirit. And I have, and many of you have, corrected lots of our theology over the last few years. And I believe that was an example of God's teaching, of God's paideia, of his discipline. Now, some people didn't like that correction process. No one likes to be told they're wrong. No one likes to be asked to reevaluate deeply held beliefs. Right? And people left the church because of that. But this is what I think he's talking about here in verse 11, where it says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. However, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. God speaking to us and correcting us is hard because we have to drop our egos. Because we have to put him first and we have to admit that we're wrong. Nobody likes doing that. especially Christians and church leaders, I think. But it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. As a teacher, I love the Mirror translation of this. The process of education is not immediately appreciated. At the time, it seems to be more pain than pleasure, but it certainly yields a harvest of righteousness for the faith athlete. I've suggested our chaplain has that as our verse of the week at some point. Okay, so that's Hebrews. So we can agree from that I believe that God's process of discipline doesn't involve punishing us, it involves restoring us, getting alongside us and building us up. Okay, so I said a look at Genesis, didn't I? So this is where I wanted to get the big lecture Bible out so I could just illustratively go all the way back. All the way back. No, that way, wasn't it? All the way back to Genesis. So let's go to Genesis 18 and 19. Now, Lillian read us some of this story last week, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but just to summarise it, this is where, in chapter 18, 2 angels arrive at Abraham's tent. This is the same visit where they tell Sarah she's going to have a baby well into old age, and she laughs at that. And then in verse 20, the angels say this: "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." There's then a period of negotiation between Abraham and God, where he negotiates how many righteous people he'll need to find in the city to save it. The starting price was 50, they settled for 10. It was, yes, absolutely. In chapter 13, the angels that visit Sodom meet Lot, who Abraham's brother, who invites them in, cooks them a meal, but the locals get wind of it and surround the house, demanding that the men are brought out, so it's a bit crude, but so that they can rape them. Lot refuses, the angel does some angel stuff to blind them, and they all run away just before the city is destroyed by fire. They are told not to look back, but Lot's wife does, and is turned into a pillar of salt. Cheery story, isn't it? So, this verse here. "Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, 'Where are the men who have come to you tonight? Bring them out to us so we can have sex with them.'" Interesting how people often read that as being a passage about homosexuality being the crime. I'm not going into it, but surely gang rape's more of the issue there than the homosexuality part of that. But my point is, we've been talking about how God's discipline is restorative and not retributive. Yet here's a story from the Holy Bible that clearly shows the opposite. People messed up. They apparently passed the threshold of messing up that warranted smiting. I don't know where God puts this threshold, but they crossed it and they deserve to be smited. The whole city was destroyed by fire. In fact, God was so angry about the whole thing, Lot's wife was turned to salt for the simple mistake of looking back at her own. So we have a problem, don't we? The version of God's discipline described to us in Hebrews and demonstrated by Christ itself, demonstrated by how Christ himself disciplined people, it says one thing. And then we have an Old Testament story here that apparently says the complete opposite. Can they both be right? Well, I'm not sure how, to be honest. Either God has changed between the two, which we believe isn't in his character, or there has to be some further explanation, some context to one or both of the stories. Now, people have been declared for blasphemy in the past for saying that the Bible is contradictory, but look at the verses. They couldn't be more contradictory, could they? And who was the most famous person who updated parts of the Old Testament? Jesus did, didn't he? Many times. The Old Testament is important. One of the many reasons is because it sets the context for the New Testament. It frames a view of the Jewish people, shows us where they were coming from when they viewed Jesus. But there are places where the character of God in the Old Testament is in conflict with the character shown by Jesus. Now, for me, Jesus then has to win every time. I saw a preacher the other week get a Bible and literally stand on it to prove that the Bible is the foundation of their faith. Well, the Bible is important. Absolutely. But I believe that the Bible is a tool to help us understand the foundation of our faith, which is Jesus. As I said before, the only agenda we should make the Bible fit is Christ. If you want to make the foundation of our faith has to be Jesus, and the Bible helps us understand that. Understand him. Should we interpret Jesus through the Bible or the Bible through Jesus? So, if we are saying that the version of God's discipline demonstrated by Jesus and described in Hebrews is the correct one, then how can we account for Genesis 18 and 19? We can't just dismiss it. So what can we do? Well, one thing to understand is there are parts to this story which are just plain weird, to be frank, and illustrate just how different the times and the societies, their understanding of God were at that point. Right? So the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin is so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is bad. Don't you know? Isn't God omniscient, omnipotent? Surely you know. Why does he? Has the outcry reached me? If not, I will know. Could you imagine God saying today, well, I've heard rumours of a war in Ukraine, but I'm just going to go down myself and find out the full picture. That doesn't fit with our understanding of God today, does it, that part of this? Okay? This bit here, this is super weird. But before they'd gone to bed, we read that bit, the men of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so we can have sex with them. Right? And this bit. Verse 6, Lot went outside to meet with them and shut the door behind him and said, no, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I've got 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you and you can do whatever you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. Can't see many fathers today doing that, can we? Thankfully. So Lot will protect the strangers, but is happy to offer up his virgin daughters out for gang rape. Right? Are the daughters not under the protection of his roof as well? Right? This is a completely different society we're dealing with here. Pardon? It's just... Genesis, and then right at the end of this chapter, so this is after Lot's escaped, his wife's been turned into a pillar of salt. So this is Lot's daughters talking. So that night they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and slept with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So she got her dad drunk and had sex with him. The next day, the older daughter said to the younger, last night I slept with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you can go in and sleep with him, so we can preserve our family line through our father. So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went in and slept with him. Again, he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. That's not something we do. That's not a bit we do in Sunday school, is it? Again, and apparently that was perfectly acceptable behaviour at the time. These were clearly completely different times to where we are today, both in their understanding of each other and their understanding of the world around them and their understanding of God. Okay? The author, Brian McLaren, puts it like this. In primary school, your textbook tells you that you can't subtract a large number from a small number. As you get older, you meet negative numbers and you develop a deeper understanding of mathematics. And then in high school, we start looking at algebra, and we don't even use numbers to subtract. I mean, if you get really skilled and you do A-levels and go to university, you start learning about complex numbers. If a year 1 teacher tried to teach algebra or complex numbers, that wouldn't go very well. As we learn, our capacity to understand also grows, and we're able to comprehend more. And I think that's what God has done throughout the ages of humanity, revealing more and deepening our understanding of him as we grow as a species. A process completed in each of us, and we rise in glory to be with him when we get that full understanding. There was no way for the people at the time of this to comprehend what had destroyed their city and how it had happened. Right? I don't know what your history is like, but The time period with Abraham is the Middle Bronze Age, around 2000 BC. It's about 4,000 years ago. Right? The stories were then passed from person to person and not written down. Genesis as a book wasn't written down to about 500 BC. So for about 1,500 years after these events we're reading about were described, it wasn't written down, it was passed from person to person as a mythology basically. Lots of the Old Testament is historically accurate and verifiable. And Genesis has some historical value, but Genesis is not a history book. Genesis is really valuable. It has some amazing imagery to help us understand some fundamental principles, but very few scholars would see it as being historically accurate. So I get back to, whose version of discipline are we going to go with? Even if we take the faith out of it for a moment and we look at it academically, the words and actions of Christ were recorded numerous times in many documents and show us that God's discipline is restorative and not retributive. Or do we go with a story that's been passed around for a millennia and a half and before it has been recorded that shows an angry or violent God? I think if you choose to believe the angry God narrative from those two, then that possibly says more about you than it does about God. I got really into researching this. So, do you know that some archaeologists believe that Sodom was a real place? Right, there's this place called Tel El Hammam, which is in modern-day Jordan. And there is admittedly disputed evidence, scientists don't agree on it, but there is some evidence that suggests that this place called Tel El Hammam was destroyed by an airburst. So that's when a meteor explodes after entering the atmosphere and superheats the air around it. And because of its proximity to the salt-filled Dead Sea, such a burst could have resulted in hot salt going up and landing everywhere for a distance around it. Now this is complete guesswork, and I'm not saying this is what happened. But let's just say that this ancient city was destroyed by an airburst or other event. People at the time would have just put that down to being an act of God. They wouldn't have understood what had happened. They'd have said it must have been God. And logical conclusion of that is that it must have been punishment for something. What if God did send someone to Sodom to try and warn them to get out? What if Lot's wife was told to run and not look back because balls of molten salt falling from the sky? At that time it would have been beyond the comprehension of the people to try and explain it. They assumed that it was punishment from God, and that entered mythology and eventually ended up being recorded in Genesis. Could God have been trying to save people, but actually ended up taking a rap for the destruction? I'm not saying that is the case, I don't know. But it's a fascinating way of thinking about these stories. What I do know is that the words and actions of Jesus tell us who God is. And that has to be our primary source and our primary focus. And interestingly, Jesus actually has something to say on Sodom and Gomorrah. In Luke 17, he says this: "It was the same in the days of Lot. People were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulfur rained down from heaven and destroyed them all." Heaven. The word heaven there is orano. It just means sky. It's been translated as heaven. Yeah? Jesus doesn't say that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah in this sentence, in this verse. He just says that it was destroyed. I think that's an important differentiation. So friends, the foundation of our faith is Jesus, who has revealed God to us. Jesus was and is God. And he demonstrated the character of God to us through his words and actions. There is nothing in the character of Jesus to suggest that his discipline is anything other than restorative. Some people like to interpret scripture to meet their own agenda. Either that agenda where they're rubbish and they feel like they need to be punished and it's comforting to understand hardship as God's punishment, or where they think that they're better than other people and other people deserve punishment for not being as good as them. And you can justify that viewpoint from reading the Old Testament stories, and you can view it from poor New Testament translations and poor understanding of Jesus. But I believe the truth revealed to us by Jesus is clear, that God's discipline is restorative and not retributive. And having said all of that, who wants to be disciplined? So, Father God, I just thank you for your discipline. Thank you for your correction. I say thank you that your heart is to restore us to how you made us. That your heart is to make us back to the pure place where we are like you and we know that we are like you. Help us to embrace that correction in every step of our journeys. Amen.
Amen.